Thanks, John. Welcome to our February lecture, and again we would like to welcome Peter O'Grady to Thurles. Peter is no stranger to us. He was with us here last year when he spoke on Ballycohey to a full house, and tonight we would like to welcome him back when he's going to speak on Sir Michael O'Dwyer, and again he's going to be ably assisted by his daughter Kira. And tonight he's also brought his friend Tariq, who is going to give us an overview on Punjab before Peter starts. So with that, I hand you over to Peter and his assistants. Okay?
How's it going? You're all welcome here tonight. I hope you find something useful from this talk. I did most of the research before Christmas. There was one stage very early on in my research that I got really worried. I thought, what the hell have I let myself in for? Sir Michael O'Dwyer is a very difficult topic. He was a very controversial man. He's virtually unknown outside of Tipperary, County Tipperary, which is amazing. But I persevered, and hopefully I've got something that's coherent and makes sense to you all. I met Tariq. Tariq is going to spend 3 or 4 minutes talking about the Punjab. Tariq is a native of the Punjab and very knowledgeable. He knows his history of his area, and basically Tariq is going to give a kind of brief overview of Punjab and a little bit about the political situation in more recent times. So I'll let Tariq come over first and do his video.
Thank you very much, Peter, Mary, and every one of you. I welcome you with my own greetings. Assalamu alaikum to everybody. Be peace on all of you. I was born in Punjab, and telling you that Punjab is can be regarded as the backbone of subcontinent. Politically, culturally, economically, people-wise, land-wise, every aspect, Punjab is the main thing in all subcontinent. What Punjab's come from, this word, it comes from Persian, Punj and Ab. Punj means 5, and Ab means water, or you can say rivers. So Punjab basically is the land of 5 rivers. That is Ravi, Satluj, Beas, Chenab, and Jhelum, and they are all contributed to the Indus River. Politically, just to tell you that in Pakistani part of Punjab, the 50% of the whole country is from Punjab. So not only the number-wise, but the thinking-wise and the philosophy and intellectual-wise, Punjab is the area which really give the dimension to the whole country of Pakistan. Not only the great generals and politicians were born in Punjab, but also great philosophers and thinkers and poets as well. Like Allama Iqbal, who gave the idea of Pakistan, was born in Punjab. Other poets like Faiz Ahmad Faiz, who also not from Pakistan, but also got global recognition by winning the Lenin Award for his thinking of the socialist and poor people. He also recognized from all over the world. Economically wise, I tell you that the staple food of Pakistan, that is wheat and rice, more or less 80% of the whole wheat in subcontinent is produced in Punjab. Pakistani part or Indian part. And the basmati rice, famous all around the world, it's come from Punjab. I was basically born in a very little city of Sialkot, that is only 5 lakhs, 500,000. Just imagine, in the population of 180 million people of Pakistan, Sialkot city is only 5 lakhs. But when it comes to the export or economy, Sialkot contributes 10% of the whole export of Pakistan. And mainly they produce hand-stitched football, cricket ball, bats, hockey sticks, and other than sports, that's cutlery and surgical items, also famous from Sialkot. And other city is Lahore. Lahore is the second largest city of Pakistan, having population of something like 10 million. Only one city have more than 10 million of population, and it's called the city of education, city of colleges. If you go to Lahore, you will see in every single street there will be some college, some school, some madrasa. They are contributing to the Pakistani education, where the education or literacy rate is not that good. Peter also ordered me to have a little comment on Indian Punjab as well, especially the event of Indira Gandhi. Just to tell you some brief about the Indira Gandhi's assassination, that when Pakistan and India was partitioned in 1947, there were three people who addressed on radio, representing their community. One of them was Jawaharlal Nehru, you must be aware of that. The second one was Mr. Jinnah, representing the Muslim community, you are aware. And the third one was Mr. Baldev Singh. Mr. Baldev Singh was the one who was representing the Sikh community. After 40 years, 35, 40 years, people of India in Punjab, the Sikh majority in that region, realized that they should also have a separate homeland for themselves, because Muslims were given their area, Hindus were given their area, and if Mr. Baldev Singh was recognized as the community leader of the Sikh, why not Sikh given the right of their self-determination or separate homeland? So when movement was started, that's called Khalistan movement. To crush that Khalistan movement, Indira Gandhi ordered, and eventually one very bad incident happened in the Golden Temple of Amritsar, where soldiers were entered in the temple, and the temple was regarded as the immunity center, or something where one can take refuge. But the soldiers killed so many people in the Golden Temple, and that was the point where the Sikhs realized that no, they should take the weapons as well. And eventually in 1984, Indira Gandhi was assassinated. So that was the brief accounts of Punjab. I think Punjab is the topic I can talk days and so long, but I want to take much of your time. I think it would be nice to say more about that. Thank you very much.
Very interesting. Thanks very much, Tariq. Kira, can you set up this is just before Kira does that, you've probably all seen this. It's a scene from the film Gandhi by Jallianwala, and basically I'm showing 3 or 4 minutes where it goes into the Amritsar Massacre, because this really sets the tone for what this whole conversation is about. Kira, if you say, and we start with Tariq mentioned the Golden Temple. That's the Mecca for the Sikhs, and you'll see the people queuing up to go through the temple on this, and then afterwards it goes straight into the scene. So Kira, you can go ahead. I thought it was any sound.
to take their handgun. Now, they go.
say the least, a very shocking event. And sets the tone for what happened for the rest of British rule in India and later in Pakistan. You can't emphasize enough how important that event was in the history of British imperialism. From that day on, the British Empire went downhill. And that is not an exaggeration to say that. Attenborough's portrayal is fairly graphic. It probably has one inaccuracy. There was very few women actually amongst the crowd. It was, but I think something like 43 boys were killed. So, you did have a lot of children. So basically, what this talk is about is probably what was Sir Michael's part in that massacre. For Indian historians, if you talk to most Indian historians now, I've got quite a few books on them. Sir Michael O'Dwyer was a mixture, as I said to Mary earlier, a mixture between Genghis Khan and Adolf Hitler. There's 9 out of 10, probably 19 out of 20 Indian historians blame him for what happened there, or say that he created the atmosphere that allowed that to happen. And there was martial law imposed after the event, and he's taken a lot of the blame for that as well. So that's the current opinion amongst a lot of very senior historians. In Britain, the opinion on him is divided. To a lot of British people who might be, part of the imperialist viewpoint, he was a great man, Sir Michael, and he did great things. And he saved the Punjab from a disaster. So opinion is very divided. He polarised a lot of people. In Ireland, he's virtually unknown, as I said. Outside of this county, I polled some people at work outside of the Tipperary town area. Nobody had heard of him. So I'm sure, most people here, you've probably heard of him. A lot of people are from the Tipperary town area. You would obviously know of him. But I would say if you went to the north of the county, there's probably a lot of people who don't know anything about Sir Michael Dyer. If his enemies are to be believed, Sir Michael was one of the most influential Irishmen that ever lived. if his enemies are to be believed, because he played a key part in the end of British Empire. I don't hold that view, that he was quite that important. And this, the slides I have here, I try to explain where he was coming from. I don't condone everything he did. In fact, there's some stuff he did that I don't condone at all. So, but I try to present, hopefully, a balanced case for his defence. So, Kieran, the first one there. Up there are some of the typical kind of opinions of him. I got those from educated historians. He was perceived as oppressive, a sinister reputation for authoritarian rule. An Indian opinion was the horrors of Sir Michael's reign of terror during martial law. So after the massacre, there was martial law. And some Indians, like Gandhi, considered martial law was worse than the massacre. And Sir Michael was directly held responsible for martial law. So we'll go back to that later. He was strongly supported at the time by the British in India, by the Anglo-Indians. And their mentality was the exact same as Ulster loyalists in the north of Ireland. So they saw him as a hard man, a tough man, who kept control. So, and also Protestants would have been very jealous of Sir Michael O'Dwyer, but they didn't have Sir Michael O'Dwyer in Ireland in 1919, because they wouldn't have slipped out of British control if he was here, that kind of thing. And one thing, and it's only my opinion, I feel myself as Sir Michael was being groomed for maybe high office in Ireland. And the Amritsar Massacre ruined that, and indeed Jallianwala Bagh and all that ruined that chance. I haven't seen that anywhere, but it looks obvious. It looks like an obvious progression to me. He was unfortunately for Sir Michael, he was due to retire 2 weeks after the massacre. He'd actually done his farewell parties and all that kind of stuff, and he was really, really unlucky that he was caught up in the Amritsar Massacre just 2 weeks before his retirement. So here you can go on there again. That's a photograph of my father's farm. Where Sir Michael grew up was in Barnestown. Barnestown is split between the parishes of Latin and Solid, and Sir Michael grew up on the Latin side of Barnestown. My brother is in the middle, my cousin from America is on the right hand side, and the two boys are the twins with the same t-shirts are Roger and Johnny O'Dwyer. Roger and Johnny are grandnephews of Sir Michael's. And when I was a kid, they spent every second day in our house, and my brother went over there to his house, and it was a big treat for me to go to, and my brother Jimmy to go to Barnestown, because the boys had a brilliant collection of modern planes and soldiers and all that kind of stuff. So we were great friends with them. And even my mother, when she first came, she was married, and she first came to Latin as a married woman. The first person to meet her when she came to Shronell was Ned Dwyer. And Ned Dwyer came over the fields, because Barnestown bounds the farm. He came over the fields to meet my mother, because he wanted to be the first person to congratulate her on moving into the area. So there was close ties between the families over the years. So Kieran can go on there. So where did the O'Dwyers come from? In his own book about the history of the O'Dwyers, he says that they were descendants from the O'Dwyer chieftains of Kilmainham. And I think he's got a point there. Because the family were pretty well off in the 1800s. And at a time there were very few Irish people who had much money. I think a branch moved to Solihull. Sir Michael's father is buried in Solihull, and so is some of his uncles. So I think there's a close kinship with Solihull. And I think that's that page in the background I actually got here. There's a John Dwyer living in Solihull Bagh, and I think that's a good candidate for Sir Michael's ancestry. So there were cousins to the Ballycohey O'Dwyers that I spoke about last year. So there was a kinship there. And in Sir Michael's book he mentions, he gives the Ballycohey incident quite a high profile. They were settled in Barnestown for at least 60 years before Sir Michael's birth. His father, John Dwyer, was a well-known man around the area of Tipperary town. He lived obviously in Barrington. He was nationalistic with a small N. I have to put a capital N there. He believed in O'Connell and home rule. And he didn't believe in violent agitation. For a simple reason, he was well off. That was really the dividing line. If you weren't well off, you were more likely to be a criminal. He was very ambitious. He had 2 sons who went to Trinity College, 2 sons were Jesuits, and he had a son in the Indian Medical Service. So that was incredible. There was a lot of rich Protestant families couldn't afford that type of education. He was highly respected in the local area. During the Freeman Revolt, he bailed out some Freemans after the field rising in 1867, including one of his workmen. He was strongly involved with the aftermath of Ballycohey. That letter there is written to Sir Charles Moore, basically stating that they would agree with Charles Moore's terms of rent and that they could get rid of William Scully. He was prosperous. He probably rented up to 300 to 400 acres at any given time. He had a large cow dairy, and that's how he paid for his education of his sons. So Sir Michael. Sir Michael was born in 1864. He was an outstanding scholar. In fact, it's probably no exaggeration to say he was one of the most brilliant scholars in Ireland in his graduation year. He really was an outstanding scholar. I was talking to Des a few days ago. Des thinks he went to school in Tipperary Town Monastery. I think he went to Shronell School. So we haven't started that one out yet. But I'm only guessing. I presume Des is too. So anyway, he sat the Indian Civil Service exam in 1882 and qualified with flying honours, as you'd expect. And he was in Lahore, if you might remember. Tariq said it's the main city of the Punjabi part of Pakistan now, in 1885. So here, but there was trouble at home. The land war in Ireland was starting to take off around the time he was doing his education. And so I came across an incident, and I think it had a huge influence on him. He mentions it in the 4-part of his autobiography, India as I Know It. Basically what happened was, his father John, the respected man I talked about earlier, he got a threatening notice. And basically he was a well-off man, so he was on the wrong side of the land war. Whereas the poor tenant farmers were into boycotting and all that kind of thing. So shots were actually fired after a meeting that he chaired. Shots were fired to the window of his house in Barrington. His daughter Mary was hit, and his brother just barely missed his brother. So Michael says he arrived home the next day to find his house under police protection. His father died a year later of a stroke, and you just get the feeling from his autobiography that he blamed it on the agitators. And I think that was a key influence on his later thinking. I think it made him maybe a little bit bitter towards tenant farmers and the like. So why did he go to India? India was very, very far away. I mean, it's far away now, so is Pakistan. But in those days, it's a trip by sea. It was a long voyage. But I think the reasons why he went out was he was a Catholic from a nationalistic family, so career opportunities in Ireland were zero for somebody of his capability. I'm sure he could have got some opportunities somewhere, but for somebody of his great capability, there was no opportunities in Ireland. So the school he went to geared students for the ICS exams. They saw that as an opportunity of advancement for Irish nationalists and Irish Catholics, which was not afforded to them in Ireland. So I think that was a key reason. And then he had a brother who was already an older brother in the Indian Medical Service. So everything was pointing towards India for him. And he physically was in brilliant condition. He was a great horseman, great physical attributes, so he was well able for it. Where a lot of other people might succumb to the Indian climate because Irish people just wouldn't be able for it. So here we can come here. So India. India is a very interesting place. That's an old map there which shows not just modern India, it shows the old Indian empires. You have Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Burma, Sri Lanka. It was a huge place, massive. hundreds of millions of people. One thing I didn't realise was that 25% of the world's GDP, they were almost like the America of their day, existed in the subcontinent. They didn't have, the Mughal Empire, the Muslim Empire, the North India was collapsing, but they still were extremely wealthy country. So there was this propaganda put out by the British that they brought all these benefits to India, like education, railways, the English language, etc., etc. Well, they did, but they took a hell of a lot of money out of the country. It's ironic that maybe 150 years after that 25% of GDP in India, guess where 25% of the world's GDP by 150 years later? Britain. So it was a massive transfer of wealth. All the European countries, major European countries, were trying to establish trading bases in India. Trading in cotton, textiles, indigo, all that kind of stuff. They all had their own little armies. Right? So the British gained a foothold in East India and Bengal. And so that's why they set up their first capital in Calcutta. It was a trading post. That's all it was supposed to be. It wasn't supposed to be a colony. The last part of India that was the last major part, I should say, was the Punjab in 1849. So it was quite late in the day when the Punjab was annexed. The key event in Indian history is the so-called Mutiny of 1857. The Mutiny was their famine. By that I mean, it wasn't a famine, by that I mean it was a key event in their history. It set the tone for Indian history for the next 60 or 70 years. It wasn't, a mutiny is an imperialist term. It was, as such, a rebellion against British rule. It was badly led, badly organised, and it deteriorated into atrocities very, very quickly. There was just one incident where 200 women and children were captured and were holed up in one house. The local guy who captured them panicked when the British started approaching. The British were now getting the upper hand. He panicked, and basically every woman and child were massacred by 4 people. 2 of them were professional butchers. They got swords and they massacred every single one of them. The British were livid. Now, by the British, I should emphasise that the British Army at the time was probably 40 to 50% Irish, probably even more. The East India Company. In fact, in one of the massacres, 2 of the troopers that tried to escape, one was named Grady, another was Ryan, and a lot of the VCs were erring by Irish people out in India. So, it's at that time in India, it's no exaggeration to say India was ruled by Scotsmen and by Irish Protestants. Probably 89% of all the senior positions in India were controlled by those people from that background. The army was Irish Catholic. So this tiny little country had control over, well, obviously Britain, of this vast subcontinent. The British retribution followed very swiftly, and it was very, very, very harsh. Any sepoys, I think there's sipatis, I think is the Indian term for a soldier. Sipati. Sipati. Okay. Any of those that were captured were executed on the spot. It was nothing to see 8 people hanging from one tree. It was absolutely nothing to see sights like that. If the soldiers were in really bad form, and if you were a Hindu, they forced you to eat meat, and then they hung you from a tree. Or if you were a Muslim, they forced you to eat pork, and then hung you from a tree. Tens of thousands of people were massacred. The result of this was that India was pacified for 60 years. The exact same thing happened in Ireland in the 98 Rebellion. It was a very similar event. The 98 Rebellion was a spontaneous rebellion in one small part of Ireland. It got out of hand, maybe not quite to the same degree. And the retribution, 90% of the people who were massacred in the 98 Rebellion were the nationalists. And that's all. The same happened in India. The vast majority of people were killed were Indians. So it had a huge effect on the mentality of the British. Up to that point, it was the East India Company, it was not really truly a colony, and up to that point, there was a lot of fraternisation between Indians and the British and the Irish and the Scots. They all got on very well with each other. It changed completely after the mutiny. From that point on, the British distanced themselves from the Indians. They now held rule from a distance. They kept the Indians at arm's length. They never trusted them again. And that, unfortunately, they paid for that. And just as one last point, the rebel forces were Bengali, because the British army at that stage was Bengali. The Punjabis remained largely loyal. They'd only just been annexed, so they weren't really as bitter as the Bengalis. So here we go on there. So then you have the Golden Temple. So that's obviously the Sikhs' holy shrine. Here we go on. So then you go into the Punjab. So that's an old map of the Punjab, which shows the Pakistani side and it shows the Indian side. It's not the Indian side. Punjab, as Tariq said, was a crucial province in India. It kept the Russians and it kept the Afghans at bay. It was a key border province in India, and it had a lot of other important aspects to it, like food production, as Tariq said as well. Punjab benefited after the mutiny. British sphere of influence. After the mutiny, India was incorporated into the empire, and now Queen Victoria was the Empress of India. Up to that point, she wasn't. And Punjabis replaced Bengalis in the Indian army, and the capital was eventually moved into the Punjab, away from Punjab. It's punishment. And they didn't trust the period. Well, again, please. So, as I said, in a third of India's wheat and a similar amount of the rice production is in Punjab. So come to Gandhi. Gandhi went to London to study as a barrister. He was apolitical. He really had very little interest in politics. One biography said that the only interest he took in any political affairs in London was in Irish affairs. I think this whole boycotting and the land agitation made him curious. What the hell are these people going on about over there? And it wasn't that deep an interest. He really turned political in South Africa. If you've seen the film, you'll know why. And he awakened his interest in huge organisational ability, and he formed his ideas about passive resistance. He bewildered his opponents. He was not a typical politician, so politicians were not able to deal with him. If he was told that, what you did was wrong, and unless he'd go off and he'd fast for 20 days and he'd say prayers all day long and this kind of stuff, and he'd say, okay, I've done my penance, so now I'm going to go back and do the same. They could not handle it. He rejected Western civilization. He started off like a Westerner in London, but he rejected Western civilization and he wanted a return to village India. It sounds very, very like De Valera. He realised quickly violence was futile against the colonies. That was a key aspect of his thinking. There was no point in taking them on by force of arms. So here. And he was charismatic. So he was preparing for like a holy war against the British. During the First World War, people say he was non-violent. He was non-violent, but that's questionable. During the First World War, he got sick as a result of all his recruitment activities to get Indians to join the British Army, to fight in France and die in France. His reasoning being that, like the rebel-knights in Ireland, if they did well in France and did their bit, England would be sure to grant them home rule. At that stage in India, as Tariq has said, constitutionalists like Nehru and Jinnah were in control. And really, Gandhi was a bit player. He wasn't that important. So what was Sir Michael doing at this time? He had become the Lieutenant Governor of the Punjab. So he's the main man. He took control. At the age of 25, this is before he was Lieutenant Governor, at the age of 25 he had sole charge over 750,000 Irish people, or over Indian Punjabis. I mean, how many Irish people can say that? How many Irish people in history have said that? At the age of 25, he was already in that position. He said in his own biography he never lost more than half an hour to the cares of public office. That's something incredible to say. He was mentally admired, he was courageous and strict. He had a big problem during the First World War. The British were at war, and he had to keep control of the Punjab. If the Punjab got out of control, India was out of control. So there was 3 or 4 different conspiracies during the war. The sycophantic conspiracy. The main one was the Dyer conspiracy. That was the exact equivalent of the freedom movement in Ireland. These were expats in Canada and America, and they were infiltrating back into the Punjab. So his job was to try and keep them under control, and he did that. 46 revolutionaries were executed in Punjab during the First World War. And quite honestly, that has to make it a little bit queasy. I mean, obviously he wasn't the trial judge, but he would have had control over what went on and who maybe got arrested, and he would have had a final say, but the second last say over whether an execution commuted or not. So he had a lot of power and influence, and he makes it clear in his own autobiography that that was an important part of his job, and he didn't shrink from, he didn't shirk from carrying out his duty. There was internment of hundreds of people in the Punjab during the First World War to keep control of the security environment. There's a huge irony about O'Dwyer and Gandhi. They were polar opposites of the political spectrum, but at heart they both appeared to believe in the same thing. They both wanted justice for the masses of the ordinary people. They both resented the educated elite that was growing up in India. They thought that this educated elite just wanted power for themselves and not for the people. So both in their own way had no interest in this. Probably the Jinnahs and the Neros of this world. Neither of them had time for those type of people. Gandhi, India lives in our villages, not in our cities. I think there's 750,000 villages in India. Security, go on again, please. So during the First World War, Punjab, with just 7% of the population, provided 50% of India's recruits for the First World War. And O'Dwyer played a massive part in that. Probably after Kitchener, I guess he was probably the second most successful recruiter to the British Army during the First World War. Like 360,000 recruits to help a lot of people. During the war, India obviously wasn't affected directly by the war, but indirectly there was a massive impact, much worse than in Ireland. There was high prices, inflation, extra taxes, monsoon failure, influenza and cholera outbreaks, and there was wars. People were weary and fed up at the end of the First World War. There was a Home Rule League founded by an Irish woman in India. At this time in 1916, the most popular politician in India was an Irish woman, Annie Besant. She founded the Home Rule Association or League in India, directly copied from the Irish Home Rule League as well. Indian National Congress in 1916 wanted the British to proclaim self-government. She was jailed in 1916 for her outspoken support for the 1916 rising in Dublin. And this was the biggest event in India in that year. Gandhi and Nehru all then got very upset over her arrest. And it just shows India was led in many ways by influence from Ireland over the political situation. Ireland, a country of 3 million people at the time, had an enormous political influence over 300 million people. It was extraordinary. But the obvious reason was Ireland was trying to break away from imperial domination. So it was a role model for India and for other places. So after the war, the British in 1917 considered they would bring in some reforms. And this was the first positive that the Indians were starting to get, and this was getting some good reaction. Then in 1919, the British made an incredible miscalculation. They decided that the wartime restrictions were so successful, they weren't, they just kept a lid on what was going on, that they want to keep them going. So the Roundat Committee was set up, and it was going to introduce 2 acts. First of them in March 1919, and the Indians were outraged. For them, this was the first real break post-mutiny in the trust that had been built up between Indians and British. So they carried me on again, please. So now Gandhi started to enter the scene in a big way for the first time in India. So Michael, as I said, was due to retire. Gandhi's career appeared to be in decline at this stage, but this act was, as I said, a major blunder. So Gandhi organised what he called a Satyagraha. So that was a civil disobedience campaign against these bills. So basically he imported his South African ideas into India. And on the 30th of March he called for a strike across the country, what he called a hartal. And that was postponed to the 6th of April. But in Delhi, for some reason, it went ahead on the 30th. And it started off as a peaceful protest, and it descended into chaos. So the troops fired at some of the protesters, and at least 4 or 5 people were killed. What was a real worry to the British was that the Hindus and Muslims joined together. And this just shows you the divide and rule, the way imperialists think. They were seriously worried about this. Instead of promoting unity, they saw this as a threat to their rule. So let's think of what happened in Ireland. It was in their interest to divide and rule, and by God they did it in India. So now the Punjab was reaching boiling point. After the First World War, people were really fed up anyway. They had expected some reforms to cut in, but now these Roundat Acts were taking place, or were going to take place. So the Amritsar authorities were concerned about this unity. So O'Dwyer and the government in Shronell prohibited Gandhi from entering Punjab on the 9th of April. So this was just a few days after the hartal was organised. In subsequent riots across India, 50 people were killed. That is, so we've had 2 lots of killings, shootings on people already. Up to that point of the 9th of April, there was 3 mass protests in Amritsar. The average attendance of those mass protests was about 40,000 people. 2 of them were held in Jallianwala, Bagh, where the massacre happened. So the people were very upset. The people were agitated. And the British needed to contain that. They needed to see what was going on and they needed to stop it. So there's a remarkable parallel with Ballycohey here. If you remember the Ballycohey thing, incident, that Scully came out to Ballycohey, and he was only accompanied by 4 or 5 policemen. And he was surrounded by a crowd of 100 people, and he went home. They were too intimidated, they went back. And 3 days later, what did they do? They came back, the local authorities, the tip town, allowed him to come back a second time with exactly the same force, in exactly the same way. So what was the predictable outcome there? It's an imperial thing. And the same thing happened here. The British should have seen what was coming. There was 3 or 4 mini massacres. There was mass protests every couple of days. It was obvious what was going to happen. So after Gandhi was banned and after he had these riots, the 2 Congress leaders in Amritsar were arrested. One was a Sikh. One was a Hindu and the other was a Muslim. The people were incensed over this, over the rest of their 2 leaders and over the rest of Gandhi, or not the rest, Gandhi was expelled. So a crowd of 30,000 people gathered on the day. The 30,000 people tried to go to the British quarter. And there was no way the British could let them in there, because if you let a crowd of 30,000 angry people into the quarter, it would have been a disaster. It would have been a massacre of Europeans. So you had a handful of troops. Now you had a baying crowd of 30,000 people. You had literally a handful of troops at a bridge, maybe 20 troops. And they were in a very, very, very volatile, dangerous situation. So eventually, their commander, as a crowd advanced, told them to shoot on the crowd. So they shot on the crowd and killed 4 people. So later on the same day, the crowd advanced again. They retreated. A few hours later, they came back, and this time they shot up to 30 people. So the crowd were absolutely out of control now. They really lost control. They rioted through Amritsar. They attacked any British establishment they could come across and killed 5 innocent British people. They weren't soldiers. 2 of them were bank managers. I won't tell you how they were killed. And they found a missionary lady who was trying to help local people. She was on a bicycle. They chased her and beat her so badly that they thought they'd left her for dead. Some Indian people saw her, pulled her, dragged her into their house, and that's how she got away. She was left for dead. There was also unrest in Afghanistan. So for the British authorities, this was a very dangerous and volatile situation. So here we go again. So then the British responded, right? So you photograph there of General Dyer. He was the man we saw in the video earlier. He was the commander of the 50 soldiers that marched into the square. The civilian authorities, as you might guess, had really lost control of the city. So de facto martial law was declared. This is an important point. Martial law really did exist at that point, even though it had never been announced. The civilians had handed over authority to the military. The crowd may not have been fully aware of that, but that was the situation. O'Dwyer made an official request to Shronell for martial law to be imposed. He was told that yes, that would be granted. It wasn't officially granted to the day after the massacre. But, as I said, de facto martial law existed. Protest meeting, this is the 3rd protest meeting at Jallianwala in about 10 days. This time there was a slightly smaller crowd of 20,000. I think this crowd was slightly smaller because they knew, a lot of people knew that the authorities weren't going to have it. So maybe a few less people, still a huge crowd. The speakers were agitators. They made no bones about it. They were talking anti-British talk, all that kind of thing. They were unarmed and they were peaceful. There was nobody with guns. There was nobody saying we got going to go out and cause another riot up in the city. There was a real mix of Hindu, Muslim and Sikh in that crowd. There was a festival going on which drew a lot of people into the city called the Ballycohey Festival. It's held every year around that time in Punjab. So here, thanks. So this is where the massacre actually happened. Those photographs were taken a couple of days afterwards. So it's really almost like a waste ground. So General Dyer marched his troops, 50 Indian and Gurkha, that's all there was. There was another 40 soldiers with no fire guns, they only had swords. And they opened fire without warning, as you saw in the video clip, on the 13th of April 1919. I would think that Dyer was unaware that there was no escape routes. He had marched in through the main route into the square. There was a few minor exits that really could not possibly empty the crowd that was in there. So from Dyer's viewpoint, when the shooting started, he expected them to disperse. They were not able to disperse. So he aimed his fire, as you saw, as well at the thickest sections of the crowd. I think a valid explanation of that afterwards was he may have thought the crowd were trying to encircle him, going around on the side. However, it's still inexcusable. The official estimate is 379 people were shot dead. It's almost definitely it's close to 600. A lot of people wouldn't announce they had somebody killed because that was telling the British that they had somebody at an illegal assembly, so they won't say that. Over 1,500 people were wounded. So it was a very, very serious incident. That's some Indian representations of the massacre. So very good. So what did Dyer do after the event? He marched his troops away, and he had no provision for medical attention. So you had 1,500 injured people, and you maybe had a couple hundred people who were dying. And he made no provision whatsoever for those people. They had to fend for themselves. They had for about 2 hours until 8 o'clock. So some people did go into the square, they retrieved their wounded, but most people were left there. Most people were dead or dying, stayed the night in the square. Give an example of one lady, she became famous afterwards, Ratan Devi. She wasn't at the massacre. She went in to find her husband. She found his body. So she stayed out. She tried to get 2 or 3 people to carry her husband's body away, but nobody would break the curfew. So she got a bamboo stick to keep dogs away so that they wouldn't tear her husband's body. So you can imagine what they were doing all around her, these wild dogs or whatever. It was a nightmare scenario. I got those that in Indian papers at the time, they took photographs of some of it, and obviously they made political capital of it, which you can't blame. Tariq told me his name is pronounced Shronell, and then that child is Ballycohey. I think that's right, and Madame Mohan, age 14, and Bagh, I'm going to try the last part of the name. They don't look like revolutionaries. That chap looks probably in his 70s, I would say. As I said, as far as I know, there was over 40 boys were shot dead. Security well in. O'Dwyer made a severe miscalculation after the event. Dyer's commander, the military commander, Benyon, asked O'Dwyer would he approve of the massacre after the event, of what was called a massacre. O'Dwyer agreed and said, I approve. That was, I thought, a serious miscalculation on his part, without knowing the full facts. And for the rest of his life, he held that viewpoint. And I would say that's one of the most serious indictments you can make against the man. He was doing his job up to that point. He was an imperialist, but I think he has, he deserves some degree of a lack of sympathy for his viewpoint there. There was censorship and press restrictions, so the news got out slowly. Indians were enraged when they started to hear what had happened, and the British had relinquished their moral authority to govern. Senior British officers, in fact, British India applauded Dyer and what he did. For them, he saved another mutiny. I went into a little bit of detail on the mutiny, and I did that for a reason. Dyer was born and raised in India. He was, I can't remember, was he 3rd generation living and raised in India. And basically, Dyer grew up with the mutiny in his head. And he was never going to allow that happen. There was going to be no more massacres of women and children. And I think that had a huge influence on Dyer's actions, on his overreaction. Gandhi was particularly upset about the injustice after imposed the martial law imposed after the event. That really upset Gandhi. It's clear, so martial law was imposed. O'Dwyer made a specific request that martial law be kept under civilian control. There's 2 types of martial law apparently, and one of them is it's civilian martial law that you tell the military what you want done, and the other type, which we normally know, is military martial law, where the military have 100% control and the civilians can only advise. O'Dwyer wanted civilian control of martial law. He was flatly refused by the British government. He was 100% refused. And they told him in uncertain terms that this was a military affair. And O'Dwyer, as one of the opening slides, if you remember, Indian opinion is that O'Dwyer was responsible for the terrors of martial law. No such thing. He was definitely not responsible. In fact, he stopped a lot of the atrocities that were going on. So he was very unfairly blamed for that. And in fact, just going back to the massacre, O'Dwyer knew nothing about the massacre until a day later. So he had no active part in the massacre, he didn't condone it, he didn't plan it, he wasn't involved in any stage in the massacre. His problem was that he condoned it after the event, without even knowing what had happened. The military used what was called resentful retaliation. So all over the Punjab, they really went to town. They weren't all done in public, they set up flogging posts. And something like, I don't know, there was 200 to 300 floggings were carried out in Punjab. And some of these, like that one, was quite a public affair, and it was gross humiliation. And there was lots of other stuff. You had to salam. If a British officer approached you on the street in his car, you had to, salam or whatever the method was. If you didn't, you were taken in and flogged. So can you imagine if that happened in Tipperary? Can you imagine if something like that was imposed in Tipperary after Sullivan Bay? That you had to gently before a British officer, can you imagine on the street? What do you think would have happened? So, it just wasn't acceptable behaviour. 108 people were sentenced to death. 7,000 people were imprisoned. So it really was a reign of terror. Nobody knew what was going to knock on the door. We all hear about that in the Black and Tan times there in Ireland. It happened on a massive scale after that. And you must remember, their people had been massacred, and they were being punished for that. So there was a lot of unsavoury stuff went on. O'Dwyer was not responsible. And that is a very important point, Mr. Medlin. So going here again. So another one of the most famous aspects of martial law was crawling order. That missionary lady that was nearly killed, on the little lane where she was found, Dyer imposed a crawling order on any Indian who wanted to pass down that street. So unfortunately for the British soldiers, they took a photo of it, which was a very stupid thing to do. And that photo is now in Cuba over in London. So you can see them forcing the Indians to go down on all fours, so they can't deny it, and it did happen. As soon as the British government in Shronell found out what was going on, they got onto O'Dwyer in a rage and said, "What the hell are you doing imposing a crawling order?" Dwyer immediately stopped it. Of course, he had nothing to whatsoever. He didn't know what was happening. He had nothing to do with it. But the Indian National Congress, there was two inquiries set up. The British set up the Hunter Inquiry, and the Indians lost faith with the Hunter Inquiry, which is equivalent really to the Ridgely Inquiry up in Ballycohey in the north. And they set up their own. That was run by Gandhi and by other Indians, and they interviewed, I have that inquiry, they interviewed hundreds of people. It's a very, very interesting inquiry. Of course, typical of the British inquiry, they didn't interview anybody who was involved in the massacres or anything like that. They only interviewed senior people. But, I mean, as Des would point out, that there's a long tradition in Ireland of these inquiries not talking to the people who actually mattered. Really, this was a continuation of the massacre, martial law. The inquiries, Indians were getting more and more upset with each passing year. Okay, so Dyer was, after the Hunter inquiry, Dyer lost his job. Dyer had actually been sent up after Amritsar to Afghanistan, and in apparently a brilliant action, he stopped the invasion of Afghanistan into India. Apparently he was a very good soldier. And he had received no criticism whatsoever from the military up to that point. After the Hunter inquiry, the politicians got involved. The props, as the military called them. And they wanted heads on a plate because they did not want Indians upset. So they wanted heads on a plate. So there was a very, very bitter debate in 1920 in the House of Commons. Dyer and O'Dwyer were up on the balcony looking down on the debate, discussed it. And basically, the House of Commons probably came down against Dyer. And afterwards then in the House of Lords, that was reversed, and Dyer came out in favour of Dyer quite strongly. So again, the Indians were very upset, the Indian politicians and Indian women at home. Gandhi, in protest, remained a vow of silence every morning for the rest of his life as a result of the House Laws debate. He refused to speak, apparently to the end of his life. I presume that's true. So, so then you have Churchill, who was one of the main politicians, as you know, in England at the time. Churchill said in the House of Commons debate, "The incident in Jallianwala Bagh was an extraordinary event, a monstrous event, an event which stands in singular and sinister isolation." What a load of good. I mean, I've just gone through the area of history. There was 4 or 5 mini massacres before the main massacre. So that was a politician term. If you substitute the word Ballycohey for Jallianwala Bagh, they were saying the exact same crap at Ballycohey. Ballycohey was an incredibly unique event. Nothing like that ever happened before. Imperialists are always saying that there's thousands of Ballycoheys and Jallianwala Baghs out there, and they keep on saying that whether it's China, whatever other countries, it's the imperial power at the moment. So I can take that with a grain of salt. It's imperial movement. So now, one of the Indian members of the government of India, a guy called Nair, wrote a book where he was upset with Gandhi. Basically, about 2 years after the Amritsar Massacre in Malabar in India, there was a lot of agitation between Hindus and Muslims. Because of Jallianwala Bagh, the British military did not intervene. Because they did not intervene, 4,000 to 5,000 Indians were massacred each other. The British military then stepped in, and they massacred almost 2,000 people. Nobody knows about it, nobody cares about it, nobody mentions it since. But Dwyer was upset. Nair's book was a criticism of Gandhi. He said Gandhi allowed that to happen because people followed his viewpoint, and that the Malabar thing was a result of Gandhi's thing. He had some minor criticism of O'Dwyer in that, basically a couple of paragraphs. O'Dwyer got very upset over that. So even though the book wasn't again about him, and he took a case in London against Nair. It became the longest case in British legal history. And Dwyer won hands down. He won. So this was a vindication of O'Dwyer, and it was a vindication of Dyer, and the trial judgment of Bones about that. So now we're coming towards the end of the story. In India, in Punjab, a chap called Uday Singh was born. Some say in 1899, some 1901. He was an orphan at a young age. He's at the back there, and he is the Dan Green and Sean Tracy of India rolled into one. He's a major hero in that country. So he joined. If you remember the revolutionary party that I mentioned in the First World War, that 46 of its members were executed, he joined that party in the 1920s. I think it was the 1920s. He went to America, he tried to bring arms back into India, he was caught by the authorities, and he was given a 5-year jail sentence. Can you imagine what a 5-year jail sentence for a revolutionary in India was like in those days? It was pretty brutal. And he got beatings. He doesn't go into that much detail, but I think it was a very unpleasant experience for the man. After that, he travelled all over the world. He travelled to Russia, Germany, America, Italy, England. Incredible trips all around the world. He ended up in England. Can't remember what year, I think it was 1938. He says he got friendly with Sir Michael O'Dwyer, that he met him, that Sir Michael befriended him as a Sikh. Sir Michael's family deny that and say that he never met him, so I don't know what the truth is. Uday Singh lied. He was a consummate liar. So it's very hard to trust what he said at any given time. But in his trial, he said that he met him. If you remember, I had a letter written by Sir Michael earlier on in one of the sections. That letter was found on Uday Singh. So he knew who he was. In 1940, 13th of March 1940, there was a talk on Afghanistan and India organised by the Indian Association in England. It was chaired by Lord Zetland. Lord Zetland was the main man in British India at the time, a very, very important person. It was lunacy that he was at that talk with no bodyguard. Absolutely lunacy. But anyway, he was there, he chaired the meeting, he wasn't the main speaker. Sir Michael was a guest speaker for 10-15 minutes, a bit like Tariq. Hopefully Tariq will do better. I don't care, you just go back there a second. Right? After Sir Michael was shot dead, he was hit by 2 bullets. The BBC had a very cynical announcement, and it is very cynical. It was announced 2 hours after he was dead. And basically, the British were at war, so Britain was under the control of a dictatorship, just like Ireland was, and just like all the rest of Europe was. So there was total control of the press, and of the BBC, as you'd expect, as it could be in no other way during wartime. So they had to decide what story they were going to put out. Right? They would have known what exactly happened and what needed to be said in the news. So they said very little about Zetland, they said very little about what went on. They concentrated on Sir Michael O'Dwyer. And basically, as part of their announcement, they said, at the request of the civil authorities, troops were called out and a number of natives were killed in reference to Amritsar. So the inference there is the civil authorities were kind of responsible for the massacre. I mean, if you go into any depth on it, that is so cynical. So they were trying to tie the murder of Sir Michael, they were trying to tie that in to the Amritsar Massacre. And they wanted to deflect attention from Zetland and whatever. Uday Singh, or Udham Singh as he called himself sometimes, was executed as quickly as they could get him home. He was executed a few months later. They just wanted to get him off the stage because he was allowed to say anything. His remains, a bit like Casement, he was buried in Pentonville prison. His remains were returned to India in 1974. He returned as a great hero. Over 1 million people turned out for the return to, I presume, the airport or whatever. And some of his ashes were spread in different parts of India, and the remainder of them remain to this day in Amritsar at Jallianwala, where the massacre happened. So they killed him there. That's an Indian representation. It's not a very accurate representation because he was actually at the side there, say where Killian is, and he was standing. And Sir Michael wasn't actually one of the speakers on the platform, which you see the person being shot. Sir Michael was sitting, say where John is there now, and Udham Singh was just over there, and he shot him twice. He fired 6 shots. 2 shots hit Sir Michael, 2 shots hit Lord Zetland, and 2 shots hit 2 of the other senior people, senior British officials who were up on the platform. He had wrong ammunition for his gun, and basically the ammunition he had was a wrong caliber, so only 2 bullets took effect. And unfortunately for Sir Michael, there were 2 bullets that hit him. 2 bullets hit Lord Zetland, and one of them just glanced off something that was in his pocket, another grazed his stomach. So Lord Zetland got very bad injuries, and the other 2 people just got hit on the hand. So it looked like he was aiming for Sir Michael. That was, that was the take on it. For me, I don't know if Tom Dwyer, I tried to get in touch with Tom Dwyer, who wrote the foreword to Sir Michael's the reprint of Sir Michael's history of the O'Dwyer clan. He wrote an absolutely superb foreword to that book, and he set me thinking about what was the shooting of Sir Michael all about. Unlike Tom, I have access to some of the papers held in Kew, and that the Indians now have access to as well. So I was able to, I think, develop Tom's theory a little bit more, and I agree with what Tom said. I think it must have been an opportunistic killing. I think Uday Singh would have been happy to kill Sir Michael, because of how he represented, but I don't think he was the main target on the day. For instance, in Q, I've seen, and not over Q, I've seen in the Indian book, that on the advertisement for that talk in 1940, Sir Michael is not mentioned. And it specifically says that only 2 people knew Sir Michael was going to be there on the night. So there is no possibility, unless Sir Michael told Uday Singh that he knew, that he could have known that he was there on the night. There's absolutely no way. Singh had a diary that he captured. That's very few entries in the diary. Most of the people he shot at had their addresses in the diary. He had Sir Michael's address in the diary, so he knew who he was. But he wrote his name down as O'Dwyer. So, and I know I've met quite a few Indian people over the years. There is massive confusion between O'Dwyer and Dyer. And I think it's an incredibly unfortunate accident of history. The names are so similar. And I mean, in his own handwriting, he wrote O'Dwyer's name down as Dyer. So what does that mean? I don't know for sure. I mean, the guy, it was hard to believe anything he said, but that was a genuine thing that he wrote down. He had a 4-page speech from the dock. He knew he was going to hang Uday Singh. He knew he was going to hang. So he had a 4-page speech, and he asked the trial judge, could he speak? The British weren't going to allow him a political speech. And the trial judge had made it clear he was told not to even have a political speech. But of course, Uday Singh was, all he wanted to do was a political speech. So he started talking, and the judge cut across him and said, you're not allowed to do a political speech. So he kept on talking. So eventually, it just fizzled into nothing. He didn't finish. But Uday Singh tore up his paper into about 20 bits, and somebody got a collection afterwards. And they got, in his 4-page document, he doesn't once mention Sir Michael O'Dwyer. He doesn't once mention Jallianwala. His whole thing is about British imperialism, about the British pulling India into the Second World War without their permission. The whole speech is in that tone. So, I mean, sure to God, if his main point of going to Caxton Hall was to assassinate Sir Michael, surely he'd change his aim and he'd say that. He doesn't. He doesn't say it once. Even after the shooting, one of the things he said is Zeppelin dead. He ought to be put 2 into him because his bullets glanced off Zeppelin. Only one dead, I thought I could get more. So, okay, you can't trust all he says, but I think the most trustworthy things he says are when he was first captured and the police took down his statements, and at the end of his trial. At his trial, you can't believe a single word he says. You cannot believe a single word. Even though he says he was a friend of Sir Michael O'Dwyer, you can't believe it. I think where he was coming from was, he was bitter over his imprisonment. His inspiration was Bagh Singh, who was executed in 1931 in India. I think he was very upset about that he was his hero. He was upset over all the executions in 1914, which obviously Sir Michael had part of there. He had his passport problems just before the shooting. He went to the passport authorities to get his passport updated, and they told him to enlist in the war effort. So he was livid, you know. And I think that was one of the reasons why he went to Caxton Hall and possibly to get his passport sorted. But he did go in with a load of gun. India was an unwilling participant in the war for most Indians, and Zetland was the main man responsible for that. And I think Zetland was the main target, and I think great if you got O'Dwyer and a few more of them. So, so that's his ashes over in Amritsar. That's a typical newspaper heading at the time. So Michael O'Dwyer shot dead, and so really was a big event at the time. So this is the last slide. This is Jallianwala as it looks today, and they still have bullet marks in I think the mausoleum there. And we had this against the Ballycohey was afloat on a very solid day, and that's the way it is today. It's a place of reverence for Indians. They're good. I actually went to them myself, And I have to say, I was treated with 120% respect. I mean, they knew I obviously, they probably thought I was English because I spoke English, and I got no bad vibes, no agitation whatsoever. I even said to a few people I was from Tipperary, and I know, they were doing anything, and nobody got upset or anything like that. So Indians are remarkably decent people, despite all that's going on in their history. So that's it.